Thanks, Dan. So yeah, many of you may have seen me talk about this last year in Ludington. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the background again, but some update about what we've been doing in the last year. As a reminder, this is a project that's run at Michigan State, and my co-PIs are Dr. Mike Jones, Dr. Brian Roth, who you saw earlier, and Dr. Rick Clark. But I also want to point out we have some collaborators around the basin we've been working with, including Matt, who talked earlier, Jory Jonas from Michigan DNR, Eyab Sahaya from Wisconsin DNR, and of course, Dan, who you all are familiar with. So the goal of this project is predicated on this background that, as we all know, recreational fishing for salmon and stock in Lake Michigan is maintained through stocking. And these decisions do aim to have that sustainable balance of predators and prey. But currently, the models that account for this predator and prey only are looking at Chinook as the predator and alewife as the prey. The Lake Michigan Committee in the last couple of years has this new stocking strategy where they would like to incorporate the other salmon and trout species into that predator-prey ratio model, and at the same time engage stakeholders in the decision-making process for stocking. And so the goal of this project largely is to determine that mix of trout and salmon stocking in Lake Michigan that would be most likely to achieve the shared objectives of fishery stakeholders around the lake. Specifically, we have 4 goals or objectives for this project. The first is that we have been engaging managers and stakeholders to determine kind of the scope of this problem, the objectives of the updated stocking decision analysis. The second goal is that we want to incorporate the new information like what you've seen presented today, including predator diets, wild productions, Chinook salmon movements, into those models to make better predictions. And then we want to forecast the risks and outcomes of different stocking strategies that consider the effects of all of the salmonine species, and then develop a model that can monitor the performance of these policies. And finally, after we finish building these models, we'd like to re-engage managers and stakeholders in discussions about the future management actions for the lake, and including salmon stocking, and then informed by these models. So last year I gave you a more of a in-depth look at what structured decision making is, but I'm just going to remind you all this is the framework of the approach that we're taking, and it's this framework for making decisions that we call values-based, transparent, and objective. And really, it's the idea is to try to apply more common sense to a complex problem. So you can see what we call this PROACT framework or PROACT wheel is a set of steps that we walk through with stakeholders and managers to help frame this decision problem. The first step then elicit the objectives that different groups have or different individuals might have for the fishery in this case. What do we want to achieve to solve this problem? The third step is then to develop the alternatives or actions that could help us to achieve those objectives. After developing those actions, we can think about the consequences. So how would each action affect or help us to achieve each of the objectives that we've articulated? That's where we get into the modeling part. And then we identify that preferred alternative. We also call this the trade-off step because we're trying to trade off among the different objectives based on what we expect to see with those actions. So just a little bit more for each of those steps. The idea is that we want to work on the right decision problem, things like what's the scale of the problem, making sure that everybody's on the same page for what we're thinking about. Then we try to define those objectives by describing the desired outcomes for the fishery in this case. The alternatives are considering any reasonable actions that achieve the outcomes. Our consequences, like I mentioned, are where we're thinking about how we can model and make predictions about how the actions might meet our objectives. And finally, then we're making trade-offs about the different levels of achievement of those different objectives. So that's kind of the framework for how I'm going to talk about those goals that I articulated at the beginning. So our first goal, as I mentioned, was to engage our managers and stakeholders in a workshop to be able to work through the first few steps of this process. So we've been working on the problem framing, the objectives, and the alternatives. I also want to highlight that you see that these arrows go both ways so that we can always go back as new things come up that we feel like we might need to incorporate. So we've been, and we also have a goal of briefing our stakeholders on the current state of the system and the models that we're using. So to date, we've held 2 virtual workshops with our group of stakeholders and managers. We get a little bit pushed back because of COVID. We naively thought maybe we could wait it out and have our in-person workshop, but We've held 2 shorter workshops in the virtual realm to walk through those first 3 steps. And we've had, I'll have the list of stakeholders on the next page, but they represent charter and recreational interests and different interests in terms of the types of species they like to catch in the lake. The Lake Michigan committee members have been involved, and then we have the Sea Grant representatives from all the states around the lake. And so this is just a quick look at the list of the folks that have attended at least one of the workshops thus far. We had some other folks that are also interested in being involved but haven't been able to make it because of scheduling. But you can see with the affiliations that we've got people that are representing different types of interests around the lake. And many of them are, I noticed on the participant list, are also here tonight. So thank you to those of you that have been involved in this process so far. So the first 3 steps, I'm just going to walk through what we've identified. So, we identify the stakeholders, or thinking about those who might be affected by stocking decision. And that's not just the people that were in the virtual room, but who else around the lake might be affected by stocking decisions, even including like tackle shops and hotels and stuff like that. Potential constraints to the decision-making process, or their kind of regulatory or other constraints that might keep us from making some particular decision. We've identified some uncertainties that might affect the decision. And then we worked through defining that spatial and temporal scale of the decision-making process. And so this sentence kind of puts together all of that information, kind of the short version of it. The problem in this case is that our goal is to determine the stocking strategy that accounts for stakeholder desires regarding a productive fishery now and in the future for all of Lake Michigan, which includes Green Bay and Grand Traverse Bay, and includes consideration of the ecology and fish dynamics of Lakes Michigan and Huron, and considers the needs for the economic sector, including tourism, tackle, port communities in all states around the lake. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it gets at this idea of the spatial scale, the different types of objectives we might have, and the temporal scale now and into the future. So that's where we're starting in terms of the problem that we're trying to work through. So then the next step was to identify those objectives that the stakeholders have. What are the things that they value and want to see achieved in the stocking in this system? And these really fell out along different lines: the ecology of the system, and then making sure it's sustainable, economics like costs and tourism, and then satisfaction for those that are out fishing. And so we created what we call a hierarchy of objectives, and I'll show that on the next slide. And this is, I want to emphasize, a draft. This is something that these are usually a work in progress as we go through with the stakeholders. So we've continued to work now on how we want to measure the achievement of each of these objectives, and we're still kind of getting through all of that step. So this is the draft hierarchy. So I want to orient you, the things that you see at the top are kind of those kind of higher level, or what we call fundamental objectives, the things that we ultimately want to achieve for this fishery. And so the group, articulated that they want to have an objective related to maintaining or improving the world-class fishery that we have in Lake Michigan. Let's see. We also want to maximize economic return for the tourism sector, minimizes the negative effects on the recruitment of other valuable species like your warm water species, and then minimize stocking costs, just understanding that we don't have an infinite amount of money for stocking. So for these first 2, for the economic sector and the fishery, they kind of had similar what we call means objectives, or ways to achieve those fundamental objectives. So things like maximizing the catch rate of kings, having some frequent catch of large fish, maximizing the diversity of or preferred composition of catch, much like what Dan asked earlier about with the survey. And we thought that part of this would be having to maximize the biomass of our forage and increasing the rate of returns to the kings on southern Lake Michigan. There was some acknowledgement that there is often a boom-bust cycle of alewife, so if we can minimize that in some way. And then the alewife would also have some effects on those warm water species. So it's kind of a network of things that the group was interested in. Again, this is draft, so there will probably be some changes as we continue to think about the objectives and making some predictions with those models. I also want to highlight down here what we called more of the process objectives. And so these were things that the group kind of laid out that they thought we wanted to think about when we're the process of making the decision. So maximizing the alignment of federal manager and stakeholder goals, improving harvest data collection for all sectors, maximizing stakeholder education regarding stocking rate decisions, accounting for those regional differences that we see in ecology and stakeholder preference around the lake, and then finally accounting for climate change. So again, this is where we've landed so far. As a reminder, we were here for that, and there is an opportunity to move back and forth as we work through the process. So then the next step was to identify, we call the alternatives, the actions that we could take that would help us achieve our objectives. Obviously, within this particular process, stocking is the main action, but we can still think about how best to stock. So the things that we've talked about thus far are different aspects of timing. So, odd, even year stocking to reduce the burden on alewife, for example. Location, which ports when, we should be stocking in the river mouth and upriver to kind of stagger the timing of when they hit the lake, stocking offshore, and then actions that might reduce post-release mortality. There were concerns about that. So, using net pens, thinking about the time of day and location, perhaps actions to deter cormorants from consuming those fish when they're stocked, and then maybe increasing the amount that are stocked to try to overwhelm that post-release mortality. Ultimately, what we'd like to do with the alternatives, our goal is to create some scenarios that would consider the mix of species stock and the preferred catch composition, understanding that these aren't always necessarily correlated, and then evaluate uncertainties about these actions. So how much does location of stocking affect the decision or objective achievement? How much of an effect do we see on mitigation measures for mortality? So these are the kinds of things we'd like to answer as we move forward and create those scenarios. And then the last thing would be, kind of when will we need to change that stocking strategy? What triggers would cause us to change our strategy? So as you can see, we're still working through some of this, but this is we've made some really good progress, I think, especially given the pandemic and the inability to work together in a room for this. So the next step that we're working on now is evaluating the consequences. And so this is those goals 2 and 3 of the projects, and we're currently working to update the data and the models. A lot of what you saw presented today is what's going to be incorporated into these models: predator diets, inclusion of new prey species in the model, information about Chinook movements among the lakes, information on natural recruitment that Matt presented. And then we've got ongoing updates of the stock assessment models for all the species. For instance, the lake trout model is under review now with the Lake Michigan Technical Committee, I believe. And then we have some other input data that we can gather for the model. So we've got kind of we've had a couple of meetings now among the project group to divvy up who's doing what and gathering those data so that we can start updating those models. And so the goal for the model updates themselves are to upgrade them so that we can evaluate those consequences and make trade-offs based on those stocking strategies that we come up with the group. We want to use then that guidance from the stakeholders in terms of what they want to achieve, what are their objectives, and those alternatives to drive that process. So we'll be updating both the stock assessment model, which is our kind of historical look at what's happened across the years, and then updating the forecasting model so that we can predict the effects of those potential actions. So we also plan to continue to engage our stakeholder group during the model building. So we would like to make sure that as we're kind of gathering these data and updating these models, the stakeholders understand what we're doing, and they can help us and give us feedback to make sure that we're, everybody's on the same page about what's happening with the model building. So we're hoping to have some shorter, maybe hour and a half virtual meetings this summer where we can discuss the models, the assumptions we have, the data that we're using, the model structure, and then continue to discuss those objectives, measures, and stocking scenarios. And then finally, in goal 4, after we've got we're all comfortable with where the models are, we can then have our kind of second real SDM workshop to evaluate those consequences and trade-offs based on what the models are giving us for outputs with those different actions. The ultimate goal with this is really just to build agreement on the management procedure for salmonine stocking decision making that can provide decision aiding for the Lake Michigan Committee that is informed by our stakeholders. So I presented a timeline last year. We're a little bit off, of course, because of COVID, but I think we're still we're doing a good job of working towards achieving all of these goals. We held those workshops in the fall of 2020. I think one may have been early 2021. Now here in the winter and through the summer, we're collecting and incorporating those new data, upgrading those models. And again, we'll be holding some shorter meetings with stakeholders this summer. And then we hope to have that final stakeholder workshop, ideally in the fall, but we'll kind of see how things move forward where we can talk about consequences and trade-offs. And ideally, of course, we'd also love to have this in person, but we'll see how things move with the ability to have meetings in person. So I think, yep, that's it for me.